So, fairly recently, I posted a video about finding forgiveness after trauma, and it's a touchy subject because it feels unjust, right? Here we've been victimized, or I have. I can only speak from my own experience. And I wanted to share a little bit more deeply and more specifically about how that played out inside my own family system, specifically with my mother. So, my mother was horrifically abusive. She would beat me with objects. Her personality would flip on a dime, and you could be loved and nurtured and so cared for. And then she could be beating me the next moment, and I had no idea why. And this started very early. I have a memory from 18 months and then 4 years old, very specific memories. And I loved my mother, but I couldn't understand her behavior. And as I approached puberty and the teenage years, things intensified out of nowhere. She announced I was now going to be a problem as I was 12, about to turn 13. And yet she threw a surprise birthday party for me with such love. She would do really caring, loving things and then twist them. Just manipulative, nasty, horrible treatment. And I was always on edge because I never knew when it was coming. And I knew I was to serve. And ultimately, I was to serve her. And all I wanted to do was escape that system. And my parents split. Their marriage ended when I was in fifth grade, and my father came back and lived in our home with my mother when I was in seventh grade until I was in 11th grade. And I begged my father at that point to please let me live with him because I felt so unsafe with my mother in our home. And he wasn't able to permit that in his current living circumstances. And I was horrified. And I just kept the focus on getting out of that family system. And I did stay in touch with my mother, but I didn't see her that often. And in my early 20s, I lived in New York City, and my mother was still living in the small town where I grew up in central Pennsylvania. And when I would go to visit, I would come back absolutely suicidal, just so traumatized, so deeply shamed, angry. Feelings didn't really match up. And ultimately, I did get clean, and I could get more in touch with my emotions once I was sober, and I got help in therapy. And ultimately, what I decided for myself was that I needed to create a complete separation. And I didn't communicate with my mother. I didn't physically see her, and I didn't communicate. To her credit, she understood my need to do that. And ultimately, once there was space, once I could really examine the relationship, examine the abuse, separate myself from it, and her, and then create boundaries for myself, develop a voice where I could speak up if I was uncomfortable and ultimately leave the circumstance. That was all necessary before I could have a relationship with her. And I needed to know boundaries. I needed to trust my own sensitivity and being, and I needed to stand up as the adult I was, which was painful. After not having what most would consider a childhood, where you're steeped in trauma, chaos, abuse of every kind, and then to develop issues in your own adulthood, it really angered me that now here I was, and I had to sort of mop up my mother's past too, to take care of myself, to learn how to take care of myself. And I had to work through that anger. But ultimately, what I came to understand was that my mother had been horribly abused. She came into her own marriage, creating her own family by recreating the trauma of her past. And her father, my grandfather, was beaten almost to the point of death by his stepmother. So you see, it carried through the lineage and the ancestry. And I'm not saying that that's my responsibility, but I am saying that I chose to look at her in a new light and one from compassion. And I could begin to understand her behaviors, her addictions, her need for manipulation. And I created the strategy of how I was able to engage with her. And most of it was indirect. It wasn't in the moment in presence. It was more through, phone calls, ultimately texts. And then I moved to the other side of the country and I didn't often see my mother. And when I did, I had to be very careful about my being and my feelings and my emotions and to really take care of myself. I think initially I set it up with a therapist who I was working with that I'd be able to check in and I would check in with friends. And then when she would visit, I'd be able to more appreciate her because I had an understanding deeply of where she was coming from. And I had much more compassion. And ultimately, when she made her transition, I realized that I had been communicating often with my mother telepathically because I was doing the same thing when she was on the other side. And I do feel her energy and I do feel her warmth and her love and her stability from the other side. And I do feel her cheering me on as I've gone really very open with my experience with my mother through my book, Toxic Family: Transforming Childhood Trauma into Adult Freedom, and also here on this channel. And it was really lovely when I received a comment from a subscriber asking about forgiveness and specifically how one gets to forgiveness with a matriarchal figure who's extremely abusive. And so that's why I was motivated to share my experience today. If you'd like more information, you're welcome to go to my website, susangould.us, and set up a time to have a chat. There's also a free course there now, Signs of a Toxic Family. And if you gathered any help or support by listening to the content of today's video or other videos and haven't yet subscribed and would, I'd be grateful and share this video with someone who might be really hurting, because there is hope and there is support and we're all in this together. And I really want to cheer you on because you can literally shift your life and live in a brand new zip code. This photo behind me, it is a photo out my back slider. I live in rural Montana after living in New York City for decades and then Los Angeles. And I have transformed with the work that I've done. If we just stand up bravely and give our inner child a chance, magic happens. It really does. So I hope this has served to uplift you. And yes, we are in this together. Take good care, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.